Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with guest doctor Lomash Roopnarine, who is originally from Guyana, who is a professor of Caribbean and Latin American history at Jackson State University. He is author of Indo-Caribbean Indenture, Resistance and Accommodation, 1838 to 1920, and Indian Indenture in the Danish West Indies, 1863 to 1873. Published widely on the South Asian diaspora in the Caribbean, he has written articles in many journals that focus on the Caribbean and Latin America. We will be discussing the article East Indian Women and Leadership Roles during Indentured Servitude in British Guiana, 1838 to 1920. So let's have a listen.
Professor Roopnarine for coming on to the podcast and to speak about East Indian women during the Indentured Servitude in British Guyana. Guyana. And before we start, can I just have you do a brief introduction of yourself?
Yes, my name is, Lomash Roopnarine, and I was born and raised in Guyana along the current coast in the county of Berbice, which is home to about 120,000 East Indians. And I emigrated from Guyana in the early 1980s and attended school in the United States. I first worked for a while, and then I decided to go to school, take school more seriously. And I finished up a PhD in Latin American Caribbean Studies at the State University of New York at Albany. I then accepted a faculty position at the University of Virgin Islands on the St. Croix campus in the United States Virgin Islands in 2002, and I worked there until 2012. I then left there and I accepted a position at Jackson State University and have been teaching here since 2012. Where research is concerned, I've been researching and writing on the Caribbean East Indian experience, migration, labor movement, identity for the past 30 years. And so I will continue to do so. And so I'm happy to be here to speak with you.
Yes, thank you so much. It is a real pleasure and an honor to have you on the podcast to speak about this. And we'll start. And so, my first question is, what was the typical life and role of the East Indian woman under indentured servitude in British Guiana? And how did these affect the conditions and differ for men as well?
Well, one has to contextualize the East Indian indenture system to understand some of the sort of inner dynamics or the defining features of the indenture system. Overall, about 500,000 East Indians were brought from India starting in 1838 until 1920, when the indenture system collapsed. Indenture really was a labor contract system whereby the workers worked for 5 years and they returned back to India. However, many renewed their contracts and stayed on for another 5 years, and then eventually became permanent settlers. So out of the 500,000, about 350,000 stayed in the Caribbean, particularly in Jamaica, Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname, and there's some, other small islands of the Caribbean. 175,000 went back to India when the contract expired, and of that figure, another 50,000 came back for a second time. Now, so that was really the statistics of the movement. So it was a busy one. At one time, 4,000 were coming in, another 2,000 were leaving in practically every year, essentially from the 1880s to about 1898 or 1900. So that is pretty much the overall sort of system, the indenture system. The question he asked, well, how did East Indian women fit into all of this? Well, I just give you the statistics. And out of that 500,000, about 25% of them were really women, meaning that for every 10 indentured servants, about 3 or 4 of them were women. And that, because of that, the low numbers, they experience in the Caribbean pan out somewhat differently than men, and not necessarily in a bad way. But let me say this, that all of them, despite the diversity in gender, diversity in ethnicity, diversity in social structure, particularly caste system, all of them entered the Caribbean or brought the Caribbean on an equal footing, meaning that they all entered as laborers, mainly to man the plantations. However, in regards to women, their experience pan out differently. So women use their low numbers in many ways to benefit themselves in the plantation system. So because they were socialized along the caste lines or caste characteristics, they gravitate towards their own culture, meaning that Indian men prefer to marry Indian women. And because of the shortages, there emerged a problem. And so women use their low numbers to advantage, so that at one point or some point during the indenture system, one woman practically could have 3, or probably even 4 male partners, which was a sort of flipped system in India, where men had more power in attracting more women. Is really a patriarchal system. And so in the Caribbean, the caste system flipped, whereby women use their low numbers to have some sort of power. I suppose one can question whether, if one woman has had 3, 4 women, did that really constitute power independence? What I'm trying to underline here is that certainly the system changed in the Caribbean, basically from the point of view of women, rather from the overall plantation complex.
No, definitely. And of course, in history, women are just not really mentioned that much. And what you're saying is really profound in the sense of how everything worked. And before we move on, can I just have you just define the caste system, just so if some listeners are listening, they don't know what that is?
Yes, and that's a good question. A caste is really a form of social structure whereby individuals are born to specific stations of life. For example, in the United States and the Caribbean, we have a class system whereby individuals are not born in specific categories and remain there. They have the option to experience upward mobility or even downward. Caste is different. One's position is fixed. And so in India, you have various categories of caste, and most of the indentured servants who came to the Caribbean came from the low caste, because it makes sense. The high caste would not leave India because they were in a privileged position. The low caste, really, then most of them indentured themselves to come to the Caribbean to work as laborers, mainly to escape this strict social structure, but also to find a sort of new way of life, even though they were not fully cognizant what they're getting into. So caste in 19th century India was a very static social structure where individuals are born to specific stations and stations of life. And over the period of time, their the ability or the opportunity to get out of fixed positions were limited, or doesn't exist, or did not exist at all.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. And I guess in what ways did East Indian women assume the leadership roles within indentured labor communities?
It's very interesting. They came not as leaders, even though they were leaders in their own environment, for example, in a household in India, and they perform leadership roles in sustaining the family. I mean, we tend to overlook that in the modern society or even the colonial records. So they did come with some level of leadership, but on the plantations, their role really was one of a subservience in terms of producing for the planters class. However, the planters class did not really engage in the day-to-day activity of producing sugar and hence profits. What they did, they administered the system in a way where they allowed East Indians, and this goes back to slavery, East Indian men in particular, to run the plantations as managers, low-level management, as drivers or leaders on the plantation fields. And women did play a role in the plantation, but many times that was suppressed. But what emerged in the plantation itself was a hierarchical system, was a stratified system, whereby men worked in certain areas and women worked in certain areas. For example, the women worked as, in the weeding gang. And in that domain, they were able to fashion out or form ways to lead themselves, one or two, maybe the leaders leading probably 20. And that was allowed. That was allowed because it was beneficial to the plantation system. The thing is, despite the rigorous and rigid was the hierarchical plantation system top down, there was some flexibility, and the planter class understood that. That flexibility helped to sustain the stability of the plantations. So they give women certain roles as long as those roles did not interfere with the flow or the daily flow of the plantation system. In other words, they do not were hoping that there wouldn't be riots, strikes, and so forth in allowing women to assume leadership roles. So women then, their leadership roles on the plantation itself was an intermediary. It would go between the European patriarchal system and the Indian patriarchal system, whereby within this system, they somehow were able to assume leadership roles. And even though those leadership roles was not recorded in the records, the colonial archives and so forth, it was there. It was there. So it's unfortunate that one has to look very hard for leadership roles among women during indenture, but it happened, and it happened in ways that one has to do some more research. It was not as clear, as open as men, or it was not as open as seeing the plantation overlords wearing this British uniform, manning the plantation on their horses and so forth. That sort of leadership was more visible.
Yeah.
But where the Indian women were concerned, their leadership happened in not as visible as men. Mm-hmm. I must also add, and perhaps you're going to ask this question.
Yeah.
Women brought some leadership roles of India cultural, which they then, after the day's work, they took back to the home where they practically take care of the men and children.
No, absolutely. And then, I guess further expanding on that, what were some specific challenges that East Indian women faced in asserting these leaderships, both from colonial authorities and within their own communities?
Well, as I said, they came not to become leaders, and so the colonial system wanted a predominantly male labor force, and mainly because they thought women would be a burden rather than a bargain to the indentured system, mainly because of the reproductive roles women play, like, uh, during pregnancy or to take care of children and so forth, would have interfered with the daily routine of plantation life. What the plantation system wanted, ideally, was a single male that had little strings attached to them that would distract them from working, on a plantation day in, day out. So the plantation system then was prejudiced to women, in that it embraced a patriarchal norms. Um, However, as I said, women was able to assume leadership roles in the plantation system, again, because of the division of labor. Other challenges women faced was sexual advances. Many worked in the plantations alone, in the fields, so we were vulnerable. Um, and sexual abuse, as goes back to the days of slavery. So they had to contend with sexual abuse, not only from European men, but Indian men alone. And as I said earlier, because Indian men, or Indians in particular, were socialized along the caste system, they wouldn't have given up that overnight. The caste system did dilute over time, but they prefer to have feelings towards their own, in this case, Indian women. Women were around. There were African women, in some case, one could say other ethnic groups. But again, the idea of how they socialize in India, they brought that to the plantation system. And actually, the caste system is somewhat survived until the 1950s and 60s, at least ideologically. Mm-hmm. And so, in some ways, it helped to, one can say, populate the Indian population, as opposed to in Jamaica, a lot of Indians understand cross marriage, married other ethnic groups, Africans. Whereas in Guyana and Trinidad and Suriname, where there were majority, they were able to sustain their ethnicity and culture in many ways because of the ways they were socialized. Mm-hmm. But so women face a number of challenges, mainly because they lack the protection. They lack the protection in an open plantation system. But, wife mothers also was very somewhat high in comparison to other colonies at the time. And again, because they were thought to socialize in a caste manner, jealousy or emerge, whereby men will compete for scarce women and, led to violence and so on.
No, definitely. And I guess, what were some of the sources or resilience or support through cultural, religious, or community-based did these women draw upon for their support in leadership?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Indian women in particular were, one can say, carriers of culture from India to the Caribbean. And because the plantation system isolated Indians in general from other ethnic groups, mainly because of divide and rule, it was a sort of safety net for the planters class, there emerged then an Indian community that really relied and focused on two fundamental factors. One, the religion, in this case, Hinduism in particular, and ecology, whereby they worked the land. They did not own land in India, but they were familiar with working the land to some degree. They were peasants. So they brought that. And so those two dynamics did not change that much. The relationship they had in India with land were pretty much transferred in the Caribbean. However, it was somewhat different. They were not because of the plantation labor. So were they able to combine religion and ecology to provide this deep anchorage of support. And in some ways, unlike slavery, the planters class did not interfere that much with the Indian community. which in some ways was bad and good as well. Bad in terms that the Indian community needed support, educational support, social support, healthcare, and so on. They had to fend for themselves for the most part. But by the other hand, they were able to develop or to carry on certain traditions from India, which again gives them this sort of boost or internal support to move on a daily basis. When compared this with slavery, and one cannot really compare slavery with indenture, but nevertheless, some of the trappings were the same. During slavery, Africans are not allowed to, per se, practice their culture or practice things from Africa. And we know that because Africans have lost that in the Caribbean. And there have been attempts to revive that. It's been in the literature. Whereas Indians, they were able to retain that one can say Indianness in India. And without that, they would have been empty souls. They would have been somewhat like the Africans, trying to reconstruct lost culture. And don't get me wrong, some of Indian culture was lost in this process. And I mentioned caste. And even Hinduism is not identically like India. What's a sort of elastic form of Hinduism survived in the Caribbean, that if I were to go to India or someone from Guyana or Trinidad were to go to India, they'll be confused. And likewise, Indians from India coming into the Caribbean. I've been at conferences where these conversations emerge. But one of the things Indians of India would say about Indians in the Caribbean, how remarkable they have been in retaining at least some of those customs from India. Whereas in India itself, they take it for granted because they're anchored in India.
Exactly. What you said is, I mean, I totally agree in terms of being able to still have that connectedness back to the homeland, because it's what, I guess, identifies people, right? And to give them that connectedness and to that wholeness within their own spirit, as well as for all humans, right? So, and how did the experience of the East Indian women compare with, I know you kind of alluded to this, with other women from other indentured communities within British Guiana or within the community or within the Caribbean?
We do not have much studies done on this comparative analysis, which I think ought to be done. But one suspects that the plantation system had a flattening experience, that once you got into it at the lower end, there's certain dynamics or dimensions you were subjected to. So then the Indian women in plantation X their experience would not be that different from plantation Y, where they were Africans. The fundamental purpose of them they bring there was to produce labor or give their labor, so the planters class can maximize profits. And in order to achieve that, there were certain systems or certain standards, according to the planters class, had to be respected, had to be followed. But I do not want to paint a picture that women, regardless of the ethnic background during this period of time, were like lambs waiting to be slaughtered. They had agency. They had techniques of to deal with domination, plantation domination, the plantation patriarchal system. And I wrote a piece on this, I'm about to share with you, and it came out at a Zoom meeting from a graduate dissertation student from Mauritius or South Africa, because Indians went there as well. And she cited what I was in the, I don't think she knew that I was in a meeting, but she cited that I wrote on a piece how women resisted the plantation system. And I came up here, I theorized a sort of form of resistance to the plantation system, and it goes like this. the women kept themselves untidy. And I said, well, that they kept themselves untidy because they were working in plantations. They were caught up in the double burden, household and in the fields, a term they use in the feminist scholarship, the double burden. And so there was not enough time to keep themselves tidy, like they're going to the office or they were going to a social gathering. And so while that happened, they also kept themselves untidy to distract men advances towards them, at least sexually. Mm-hmm. And so that thought of theorization caught the attention of a few people, especially ladies that never thought of that. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at the Indian women doing indentures, some of them, or most of them, they kept themselves untidy because they believe that will stop the advances towards them from men. And I think that did happen. Mm-hmm. But you don't find these things in the colonial records. You don't find this in the research. And so one cannot say it's factual. That's what they theorize. That was one of the agencies, one of the techniques they use to survive the plantation system. And, within the Indian population, women population, there were also divisions within the Indian women group, especially in the plantations. There were women who were leaders, not many, but 1 or 2%. And they were not only leaders on the plantations, they were like counselors. They're like, when they get together at lunch, they would discuss their problems, social problems, or children problems, or some of the challenges they face, lack of money. I mean, all of that. So these leaders then were not only leaders per se to see they perform their task, their work, but they were counselors, they were advisors, and they listen, and they give advice. And I believe that is very useful, helpful, attractive, and so on, because I think men would have had a hard time trying to resolve some of those problems that was so much associated with the women experience. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so I don't know if you're familiar with something called a panjat. Panjat is it is also happens in Africa in traditional societies, where you have a council of 5 men who apparently are very versed in the community. They're like judges. And so should there be a problem in rural India, say a husband and a wife is about to divorce, or they're fighting, or a neighbor is fighting with another neighbor, the 5 men will listen to the cases. And then they will make certain decisions. And sometimes they resolve the problem, sometimes they don't. But that exists, that mechanism of solving disputes exists. That was brought to the Caribbean, in British Guiana and Trinidad and so forth, and survived during the indentureship and even afterwards. I remember distinctly in the village I grew up in the 1970s, 2 neighbors were fighting. And what happened, about 3 men in the village came at night, and I could hear them discussing these problems. That was an experience drawn from India, then carried on to the indentureship. Women also, again, did have a sort of panjat. They were not excluded from this experience. It would make sense, okay? And so I think the panjat experience, despite it was male-dominated, women also used that to resolve problems when men were not around, especially in the plantations or in the household.
No, so that's a great resource that they were able to rely on to be able to resolve situations that came up. Now, for yourself, Professor Roopnarine, what were some of the resources that you accessed to research this paper on the indentured Indian women?
Yes, I did research. I have visited so many National Archives, one in London, the Kew Gardens, the Indian Record Office in London. I did visit really an archive in Mauritius, the Indian Ocean, and of course, the British Parliamentary Papers at State University in New York when I was a graduate student, and Guyana, Trinidad, Suriname. Never gone to Jamaica yet, but I will. So I visited many archives for years, and that's where I found two things. One, I found out that not much had been written on leadership of Indians in particular, and more so less on women. Also, a lot has not been written on the mental aspect of these indentured experience. Some of the records are there because mental illness is somewhat high. We know that because each ship, when it went back to India, about 5% of them were declared insane or marginally insane, and they were put in a particular area of the ship. And some did not make it back to India when their contract expired because they were not well enough to endure the journey back to India, which was 90 days, the days of sailing, and about 60 days with the steamship towards the end of the indentured system. So those dynamics play out as well. So when I was doing research, I found out those two areas were pretty much missing. And I was able to find some leadership roles among women, in particular when they strike or when there were protests. But I did not find, in the case of Guyana, one particular woman who said, look, she did this and that. She was like a ringleader, or she stood up and she made speeches and so forth, and that was recorded. I did find some men like Bichu, a guy named Bichu, who wrote quite a bit, Indentured Servant. Some women protested in Suriname, and that's documented there. So the archival records do not reflect or do not show really a lot of leadership roles among East Indian women. And I find that hard to believe.
Yeah.
And one would not expect the colonial records or recorders to record things or be inconsistent with their experience, even though they should have been, neutral, objective, fair, and so on. They recorded things that suited them, or things that were extreme. And so, even though those records do not reflect many leadership roles in British Guiana during this period of time, I believe that it had happened. So that pushed me to go further. And then I did some field studies, and I interviewed women who were working on the plantations. And from their experience, I can able to look back and say, this might have happened. Because the structure of the plantation system did not change much into the modern period. The people might have changed. I mean, the white people are not there anymore, but the brown-skinned people and dark-skinned people were there. They were the inheritors of this plantation system. And they did not do much to change the structure. In fact, the nature of a plantation system or plantation zones is based on firm structures. Otherwise, it wouldn't survive. Yeah, so those are some of the things I did, and I really enjoyed it. I learned quite a bit. Where, for example, Sardari, that is a word for a female, Hindi word for a female leader. And I document that in the article. And again, how these women were able to make a life out of practically a very stern system. And again, one of the things I was trying to underline, and one of the objectives of the paper, these were not women, I hate to use this word, spineless. These were not women who did not have the capacity and the capability to fashion out a life out of adversity, to take advantages of an adverse situation in terms of agency, the word they use quite a bit in resistance theory or resistance literature. They had this sort of agency. And I'm still convinced that women in the Caribbean are very strong people. And, in the article, I talk about box hand. They call it something else in Jamaica, where women will come together and pool, $20 a week. So each week, if there are 20 of them, would each one would potentially receive $400. Then you can go ahead in the market and buy and sell and so on, as opposed to going to the bank. My mother did that. And she was a leader in that, actually. And then after all of them received their money, it keep on going. It keep on going. And that is rather unique. And, this is probably not too much related, but when I was in the Virgin Islands, you see, when I left Guyana in 1982, I spent a lot of time in the United States. I couldn't afford to go back to Guyana because I was a student and so on. So when I went to the Virgin Islands, I accepted this position. I'll find the women control the household, women at the grocery store, the men will be there, but they will pay, but the women do everything. Everything. It's really a matriarchal society. And most of the Caribbean is like that. Matriarchal in the presence of men. In the United States, in North America, you find deadbeat dads and all of that. And then women become breadwinners and household leaders and so on. That's a different case. In the Caribbean, the man will be in the house and the woman still will control or run everything. That was my experience with my mother and our 7 children. And not that my father did not interfere with that. And that did not happen alone in our house, in the community. So those things were not really, they don't emerge overnight. They have deep roots that came from somewhere else or were really developed within the Caribbean, the plantation system.
No, definitely. And I'm glad that you mentioned about foxhen, because these are the things that aren't necessarily going to be found in archival records or even documented. It's something that's just passed down from generation to generation to be aware and to know what that is, right? So
yeah.
These are again one of these things that are again not necessarily going to be written and documented per se. And then I guess this leads into, what would you give as advice for someone researching this area of indentureship?
I'm glad you asked that question. A fellow by the name of British Law, who was a scholar, he passed away 2 years ago in Fiji. Indians went there as well as indentured servants. And when we met up at a conference in Mauritius, he was almost like a mentor to me, and we started talking. And he recognized that the study of indentureship, not only in British Guiana, across the globe, had hit what is called a diminishing return. That it started out with Europeans, then it shifted to Indians, people, the descendants of indentured servants like myself. Then it also moved to the diasporic community overseas, like in North America, in his case, to New Zealand and Australia. And in my case, I'm from Guyana, but I live in the United States, writing back about Guyana and the Caribbean. And that has been the pattern. So, for example, University of Guyana does not have a program or an institute on the study of indenture, despite the fact that Indians are the majority. Okay, the same thing in Trinidad; they may have courses. So, my advice to a scholar out there or any person really that continue to research and write about Indian indentureship, that it's a growing field, and it really needs more people to get involved, and it will eventually grow to a point where it will be attractive on a worldwide scale. Right now, there is what is called Amina Gafoor Institute in London that deals with the study of indentureship, and there's a journal there. That happened like 4 years ago. Then in Fiji, there's the same thing. So there are only 2 really institutions or 2 sets of journals studying indentureship. So we need people more to study and to bring out this, I think, a sort of rich history, really, particularly in the Caribbean. So yeah, I advise people to continue, and it's an enjoyable experience. I mean, going to these records, going to different places, having work produced in different journals, go to conferences. Next year is a huge conference in Trinidad. Um, then a year before that, that was in Fiji. I was there. The government invited me to come. And so it's not a parochial field. It's not the insular field. It may appear to be that way, but one can really get involved and have a sort of expansive experience.
No, as I said, I couldn't agree with you more. I do find that looking into this type of history it is very rewarding, and there is a lot more to it than just what is on the paper, so to speak. Because
Yes.
you're having to, yes, you read what's been documented, but as well you're inferring a lot based on what you probably know yourself as to what's been taught to you by your parents or your grandparents, and seeing how those two match together, or how can that be further put forward. So, I just want to thank you so much, Professor Roopnarine, for coming on. And as we end the podcast, I would just like to give you an opportunity. Is there anything else that you'd like to say that when it comes to indentured East Indian women that we didn't discuss in regards to British Guiana?
What I want to say in all of this, we need to do more research to find out more, in particular, what happened to Indian women during the indenture period. Not only for the sake of what happened, but how they were able to apply themselves that it matters today. What sort of journey they experienced and how they took that journey and move on in the contemporary period. And the contemporary period, Indian women face a lot of challenges in the Guyana or in the Caribbean in particular. And this is kind of sad, really. Suicide rates are very, very high among Indian people in Guyana. If it is the second highest in the world after Sri Lanka and Fiji, very, very high. For example, anytime I go back to the village I was born and raised, somebody will commit suicide. Somebody. Anytime I go back. Just to show you how frequent this thing happens. So, in some ways, even though Indian women appear to be emancipated for the indentured system, in a sense, they're no longer chained to that system. They in many ways, they are dragging the chains of indenture. And that happens because of a lack of resources to deal with some of the sins of indenture that are inflicted upon them. I mean, in the community relies on self-sufficiency or internal support to deal with some of this trauma, some of the stresses, some anxieties, and so forth. But given the fact that Guyana is a poor country, in particular, it's getting there because of oil, getting out of there because of oil, but that will take some time. The resources are yet to penetrate this community in ways to resolve some problems, which we know can be resolved because it was experienced or treated in other communities. So resource is very vital. So yeah, so even though my study in particular of women on the indenture, it does not stop there. It's continuing, and I will eventually find the time to do some studies on Indian women in a contemporary period, which would be nice to add to this historical piece. But yeah, and I encourage anyone out there to study East Indian women, not only in Guyana, but throughout the Caribbean, women as a whole. I mean, there is an institute at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad that deals with the study of women, and that is forward-looking. So they're doing some stuff there on Indian women. And there are a lot of feminist scholars emerging over the year. And, I know I'm a guy, but I've written this because this is part of my history. We can't really think and act in a box. So, okay, only a woman could write about women, and a man should write about men. I don't believe that, but I like to leave it at that.
Okay, no, thank you so much, Professor Roopnarine, and I really do appreciate your time and for you to be able to come on and discuss this, because again, it's part of the narrative that's not really spoken about. I know that we talked about this before we started to record, and as I said, I'm just so appreciative of you coming on, speaking to this, and as well furthering that story, that narrative, and that others can be able to know, and to know that they can be able to still look at this and from a different perspective. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to do this interview.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yep. Take care. Bye-bye.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.